Moments ago, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival.
Foreign policy doctrines are a statement of a country's belief system that will guide its foreign policy decisions. Students of American history might be familiar with the Monroe Doctrine that forbade European countries from obtaining new or reclaiming any former colonial possessions in the Western Hemisphere, or the Truman Doctrine, which pledged the United States to assist any foreign power resisting communist aggression. Or you might be familiar with the Soviet Union's Brezhnev Doctrine, which asserted the right of the USSR to intervene in any Warsaw Pact country if socialist rule was threatened. But foreign policy doctrine is not confined to just continent-striding superpowers. The recent Israeli attack on the Iranian nuclear program, Operation Rising Lion, was conducted in accordance with one of Israel's own, the Begin Doctrine, in which Israel asserts that it will use any means at their disposal to prevent a hostile power from obtaining a nuclear weapon. The formation of this policy dates back to a similar, though smaller scale action against another hostile power, Operation Opera. And that's the story I want to tell you in this video. My name is Grant Hurst, and you're watching Casual Historian. Let's get started. Like most Arab countries, Iraq-Israeli relations began before either country's independence. In the aftermath of World War I, Faisal I initially claimed the throne of the Greater Syrian Kingdom, which included modern-day Israel, and after his defeat, he was given the throne of Iraq as a consolation prize. And from then through Saddam, Iraq had a pan-Arabist bent in its foreign policy. Iraq would be where many Arab Palestinians, including the Grand Mufti, would flee after their 1936 revolt, and would be supporters of the Iraqi revolt against the Allies in 1941. They continued to support the Hashemite claims and ambitions in Palestine in the aftermath of World War II, and were one of the Arab states that declared war against the Jews in 1948 to prevent the establishment of Israel. But unlike all the surrounding states, Iraq never signed a peace treaty or a ceasefire agreement with Israel. Considering they are 600 miles away, they probably never considered it necessary, and this hostility was maintained through the ascension of the Ba'athists after the 1968 coup. The existence of an artificial Zionist entity symbolizes the negation of the Arabs' historical right to existence and is a slight to their honor. This bellicose entity is nothing but a terrible cancer that dangerously spreads beyond its borders. We must fight Zionism in every possible way. Arab Jerusalem awaits the Arab Saladin who will redeem it from the pollution with which Zionism has stained our holy places. Saddam Hussein, who becomes vice president after the coup, and then quickly takes de facto control over the government by the early 70s, has dreams of becoming the next Nasser, especially after Anwar Sadat breaks ranks with the Arab world by negotiating with the Israelis. He begins by improving Iraq's conventional military strength by signing a mutual assistance pact with the Soviet Union, supplying them with oil while receiving weapons. This gives the Iraqis cover to revoke the foreign oil concessions and nationalize the oil industry. But Saddam didn't want to be overly dependent on any one nation for its military or economic survival, and thus wanted to diversify its supplier of arms. And there was a recalcitrant state in Western Europe more than willing to fill that role. Until the 1970s, France had been the most pro-Israel country in Europe, being the only one willing to openly sell arms to the Israeli Defense Forces. France and Israel had worked together during the Suez Crisis, while the Israelis provided the French with intelligence during the Algerian War. Most importantly, though, was France's cooperation with the Israelis in creating the latter's secret nuclear weapons program. But this began to change after de Gaulle took power in 1958. De Gaulle and the French Right's vision for its future foreign policy involved placating the Arabs in order to maintain influence in the Middle East and secure its access to oil. And this begins by distancing themselves from the Israelis. De Gaulle had the story about the construction of the Dimona reactor leaked to the Daily Express in London, forcing Ben Gurion to publicly reveal the reactor project to the Knesset and saying they would allow American inspectors in. And after the Six-Day War, the French cut off arms sales to Israel after the preemptive attack on Egypt, against the wishes of President de Gaulle. And whatever sales were still happening would be fully ended after the Yom Kippur War, leaving France in need of a new customer to keep its domestic arms industry afloat. In 1972, Saddam Hussein met with Prime Minister Jacques Chirac in Paris, where they negotiated a deal where Iraq would keep the pre-oil nationalization agreements with France in exchange for weapons. Chirac then visits Baghdad in 1974, where they begin talks about France building a nuclear reactor for Iraq. By 1980, France became Iraq's second largest arms supplier, making up about a quarter of Saddam's arms purchases, including Mirage F-1s, Alouette helicopters, and Crotal 1 SAMs. But France was far from the only country to give in to Ba'athist demands in exchange for oil. Saddam offered to lift his oil embargo against Britain after the two had severed relations due to the former assassinating a political opponent in London. Iraq threatened to cut off oil sales to Canada in 1979 if its newly elected Prime Minister, Joe Clark, followed through on his promise to move Canada's Israeli embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And Saddam Hussein made liberal usage of oil embargoes to get other countries, such as West Germany, Belgium, Ireland, and Japan, to change their stance on the Palestinian issue. Iraq now has a powerful military force well equipped enough to deter an American landing or an Iranian or Syrian attack. In offensive terms, this complement might pose some threat to Saudi Arabia, but it posed little real threat to Israel. This was the situation until very recently. Since Iraq settled its border differences, its military planners have been able to concentrate far more on the larger Arab conflict with Israel. With its newly empowered military, Iraq's foreign policy ambitions grew, such as its territorial claims on the Iranian provinces of Khuzestan and Baluchistan, as well as claims to the entirety of Kuwait. And they became the leader of the effort to isolate Sadat after the Camp David Accords, declaring economic war on Sadat, Zionism, and American imperialism. This, combined with the political brutality at home, made Saddam the undisputed leader of Iraq and the top contender for the Arab Saladin. Hussein is little troubled that many Western observers regard him and his colleagues on the RCC as wild men of the Arab world. Beyond their borders, they prefer to be feared rather than liked or understood. Rumors about an Israeli nuclear weapons program had been floating around since David Ben-Gurion publicly admitted to Israel's nuclear energy program in 1960, and Saddam would not be the first Arab or Muslim leader to attempt to match the Zionist entity's technological ferocity. After taking power in Libya, Muammar Gaddafi attempted to buy a nuke wholesale from China, who, for obvious reasons, said no. Gaddafi got another opportunity in 1974 when India successfully detonated its own nuclear weapon. At a meeting of Islamic countries, Gaddafi met with President Fazl Alahi Chaudhry of Pakistan, who was starting his own nuclear weapons program to reach technological parity with India. Gaddafi would provide funding to the program to the tune of nearly $1 billion. His idea was that Pakistan was just far enough away and disinterested enough in the Arab-Israeli conflict that the Israelis wouldn't feel the need to attack their program. Gaddafi, for his part, was hoping the Pakistanis would provide Libya either with a completed bomb or the nuclear expertise to quick start his own program, which ended up not happening, hence why his nuclear program was so underdeveloped that he was willing to give it up in 2003 after the invasion of Iraq. In support of Pakistan's program, Gaddafi would buy large quantities of uranium from Niger and funnel them to Pakistan. The Syrians would express interest in a nuclear program of its own numerous times. Ba'athist leaders of Syria made numerous statements about never negotiating a peace treaty with Israel so long as the Zionists had technological superiority, and in the mid-70s reached out to France and India for help in building a nuclear program, both of which turned him down. In the 80s, Hafez negotiated contracts with Swiss and Belgian companies for nuclear reactors, but they were never signed. Hafez's son, Bashar al-Assad, would revive the nuclear program after his father's death, which itself would be destroyed by the Israelis in 2007, and you can watch this video to learn more about that story. Saudi Arabia also flirted with getting its own nuclear program in the 1970s. Similar to Iraq, they had begun purchasing weapons from France in 1973 and secretly signed a deal for a reactor in 1975. The Saudis feared that a revolutionary regime like Ba'athist Iraq would upset the regional balance of power too much if it possessed a nuke. But the deal ultimately fell through due to a combination of the US getting the Western world to agree to stricter controls on nuclear proliferation, as well as the Saudis being unwilling to increase the general level of education of its populace, fearing it might inspire revolt from within. The first and so far only Muslim country to ever obtain a nuclear weapon is Pakistan. With money from Gaddafi's Libya, they bought a nuclear reactor from France, which was built in 1975. Followed by Pakistan sending physics students to Europe to learn from active reactors, and by 1981 its program was far ahead of any other program in the region, save for Israel. Pakistan would detonate its first nuclear weapons on May 28, 1998, a few weeks after India's second official nuclear tests. And in the 1970s, Saddam would apply Iraq for membership in the nuclear club. Like many countries in this part of the world, they started their nuclear program back in the 50s. This wasn't so much for energy or even medicine so much as it was for prestige. It was one of those things that a country could do to show that they were a modern independent country, and both the United States and the Soviet Union were offering assistance in getting their allies and third world countries access to nuclear technology so long as they agreed not to pursue nuclear weapons. Iraq would join the International Atomic Energy Agency in 1959, after which the Soviets agreed to sell and build them a nuclear reactor, which would be completed in 1968 and upgraded in 1978. Hundreds of Iraqi students would be sent to the Soviet Union to receive training, all the while a mostly Soviet staff would operate the reactor facility at al-Tuwaitha, 15 miles south of Baghdad. This allowed Moscow to closely monitor Iraq's usage of it, making it difficult for the new Ba'athist regime to utilize it for a weapons program. Saddam would place the Iraqi nuclear program under his direct control in 1973, and would begin to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into it from the recently nationalized oil industry. He would also hire a Palestinian company operating out of Beirut, Arab Projects and Developments, to recruit Arab technicians and engineers to begin replacing the foreign operators of the Soviet-built reactor. During his 1975 trip to France, Saddam was shown a new 500-megawatt breeder reactor at the Qadarashi Nuclear Research Center, which Saddam was interested in acquiring, but Jacques Chirac refused to sell one. However, the French did agree to sell Iraq a pair of reactors called Osiris and Isis, which were capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium. Prime Minister Chirac and President d'Estaing were well aware that this could give the Iraqis the ability to produce enough fuel for a bomb, but they justified it on grounds that they believed they could keep a close enough eye on it to prevent its weaponization. But it was also a kind of payback against the French left, who had helped the Israelis build their reactor that eventually created the first atomic bomb in the region. But before we continue, I would like to take a moment to thank the channel members and patrons for helping keeping Casual Historian going. These supporters help keep the channel going when the algorithm or the sponsors don't feel like giving the videos a fair shake. And quite frankly, I would prefer to be a little more dependent on direct support of viewers than on AdSense. Supporters get a number of perks, such as access to an exclusive Discord server, as well as getting your name and the scrolling chyron at the end of videos, as well as early access to ad and censorship-free versions of the videos. And depending on which level or tier you join at, you also get access to the scripts I use to make the videos, as well as the notes that I use to make those scripts. But at the end of the day, I know that most people who choose to support me or any other creator is because they think what we do has value. They like the videos we make and they want to see us make more and better. And with your support, we can. And so if you believe that you do get a lot out of these videos and you have the means to do so, then I would suggest becoming a channel supporter. You could click the join button below this video, or you can go to patreon.com/casualhistorian and choose a membership tier that's right for you. The current difference between channel memberships and Patreon is that at the moment, Patreon has more options in case you want to give additional support. And Patreon also offers annual subscriptions, whereas channel memberships at the moment only offer month to month. So thanks to all the patrons and channel members, past, present, and future, for supporting this channel and making these videos possible. But for now, let's get back to the history. The reactor sale included training for Iraqi scientists in France, as well as enough fuel to build a bomb if it was received all at once. The contracts also included costs for building the infrastructure to house the reactors, which incorporated a concrete dome over the site in order to protect the reactor from attacks, costing the Iraqis $3 billion. Now, the long-term intent of the program was obvious to most observers, although the Iraqi government was careful to explicitly state that the program was only for energy. But Saddam himself was less careful than that, and admitted the true purpose in an interview with a Lebanese journalist. Iraq's acquisition of nuclear technology was the first Arab attempt towards nuclear arming, although the officially declared purpose of the construction of the reactor was not nuclear weapons. And Israel was the primary target for Saddam's bomb, citing the rumors of the Israeli weapons program as justification for his own. The intent was enforced in secret provisions of the contracts signed with French companies that forbid Jews from working on construction or maintenance of the reactors in either France or Iraq. And after the contract was signed in November 1975, Saddam had set a goal to obtain a nuclear weapon by 1985. The French had been willing to sell the reactors that could produce weapons-grade uranium, but not the equipment needed to extract and process the plutonium needed to build an atomic bomb, but Italy was. In 1976, the Italian company, Technet, signed a contract to provide the equipment and training for plutonium extraction, the labs for which would be built at al-Tuwaitha. Saddam would try to keep the program secret for as long as possible. He had Iraq sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as well as obtain a seat on the IAEA Board of Governors. He He also had the scientists sworn to secrecy and sequestered from their colleagues both domestically and abroad, which slowed down initial progress on the weapons program. Between the French reactors and the Italian plutonium labs, Iraq's nuclear program could produce enough plutonium for one bomb after 1 year of operation, with the reactors expected to become fully operational sometime in late 1981. But the program couldn't be kept secret forever. In January 1977, the U.S. State Department starts asking the Italian government about its involvement with the Iraqi nuclear program, and in June of that year, the French government officially announces the sales of the Osiris and Isis reactors, which is followed by the Italian government officially announcing its deals with Iraq in October of 1978. By the late 70s, Saddam had successfully positioned Iraq as the leading Arab power in the region, and the world was taking notice. In one key respect, however, Iraq may be developing a military capability unmatched by its allies, with a potential for threatening Israel which has not existed before. This is Iraq's potential nuclear capability. Iraq has conventionally armed Soviet missiles with the range for striking Israeli cities. With the development of the French-built Osirak reactor near Baghdad, it may be intent on acquiring the material and technology for arming these missiles with nuclear warheads. The Israelis were the first to become aware of the Iraqi deals with France as early as 1974. The Mossad alerted Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin about the goings-on at al-Tuwaitha, at which he decided to enact diplomatic options. He started by sending his defense minister, Shimon Peres, to meet with Chirac to persuade him not to sign the deals. But the French premier said that the contracts were too valuable to French industry to cease. Rabin himself would reach out to Jewish American groups to lobby Congress and the White House to stop the deal. And in a meeting with Ambassador Ben Eitan, Chirac assures him that France would protect Israel from any Arab threats. When Menachem Begin became prime minister in 1977, he was informed of the Iraqi nuclear program and was upset with what he saw as an insufficiently urgent attitude of Rabin's government. Israeli scientists tell Begin that the French reactors could potentially produce enough plutonium for 2 or 3 bombs in a year. The prime minister would authorize more aggressive action to dismantle or delay the activation of the reactors. The Israelis weren't the only ones who suspected the true intent of Saddam's nuclear program was weapons of mass destruction. The CIA came to a similar conclusion, though the attitudes of the Carter administration predisposed them to not take Israeli concerns as seriously. We have no hard evidence that Iraq has decided actually to acquire nuclear weapons. We believe, however, that the Iraqis have at least decided to put themselves in a position to do so by developing a relatively self-sufficient nuclear base that could produce such weapons eventually. The main difference between the CIA and the Mossad's assessments of the situation was timing. The CIA insists that based on Iraq's current trajectory, they couldn't produce a bomb before 1985, whereas the Mossad's assessment was that Saddam would have a usable bomb by 1985. The difference comes about from their agency's respective trust of the French. The Americans believed that French observers would prevent the Iraqis from using the extracted plutonium for a bomb, whereas the Israelis feared the Iraqis would. The Carter administration put a lot more faith into the enforcement mechanisms of the IAEA and the Non-Proliferation Treaty than the Israelis did. And to be fair, the Israelis were right to be skeptical, considering the fact that they built their nuclear weapons program from a reactor they bought from the French, who were willing to look the other way in exchange for data from said reactor. The Israelis feared the French would be just as lax with Saddam as they had been with Ben-Gurion, which a CIA report confirms was possible. If, as expected, the French do provide highly enriched uranium, Iraq might be able to deliver this material and build an air-deliverable nuclear weapon by as early as 1981. If spare loadings were also furnished, Baghdad might be able to build several such weapons in the same time frame. Diversion of highly enriched uranium could not be accomplished without terminating or conspicuously violating international safeguards. The Israelis would begin a public diplomatic campaign to pressure the Europeans to stop aiding Iraq's nuclear program, but the French wrote off Israeli concerns. When Foreign Minister Yitzhak Shamir visited France in 1980, the French charge d'affaires insisted Israeli fears were unjustified, claiming that Saddam wouldn't strike Israel out of fear of killing Arabs in the occupied territories. The Italians were just as blasé about it, claiming that their signing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty prevented their scientists from being used to create nuclear weapons. The Carter administration's response to these concerns was to urge the Middle East peace process to a swift conclusion so that Iraq and the other Arab states would see no need for nuclear weapons. The Israelis quickly came to the conclusion that they would have to act on their own. Under the leadership of Yitzhak Halfi, the Mossad began to closely monitor Iraqi activity in the mid-70s, especially those of Iraqi scientists in France and Italy. Israeli agents across Europe began sending back reports of firms across the continent receiving orders from the Iraqi government for nuclear equipment. They recruited diaspora Jews working in or closely with the nuclear programs of European countries to deliver intelligence on the progress of the reactor construction and providing the names of scientists involved. Along with Hofi, Begin had these operations known to his security cabinet, consisting of himself, Hofi, Defense Minister Ezer Weizmann, the head of Amman, Yehoshua Sagui, Foreign Minister Yitzhak Shamir, Agricultural Minister Ariel Sharon, IDF Chief of Staff Raphael Eitan, and his Deputy Prime Minister Yigal Yadin. They were divided on whether to take military action against the Iraqis, with Hofi, Sagui, and Yadin opposing it, with Eitan, Sharon, and Shamir supporting. And although Hofi opposed armed intervention, the department heads of the Mossad were supportive. Begin wanted his cabinet to be on the same page, so until a consensus could be built, he would approve sabotage operations against the Iraqi nuclear program. Well, we must do more to stop this madness than just send diplomatic requests. Hurt them, and hurt them hard. A joint team called New Era, consisting of representatives from Mossad, Amman, and the Foreign Ministry, was dedicated to preventing Iraq from acquiring nuclear weapons, which would be headed by the Deputy Director of Mossad, Nahum Admoni. They tried to reach out to Iraqi scientists and military personnel, but Saddam's party purge tape did a lot to scare them into silence. So they resorted to the tried and tested method of planting bugs in telephones and offices in Paris and Rome. The biggest act of sabotage happened in April of 1979, when Mossad infiltrated a warehouse where the completed Osiris reactor was being held until its delivery. After distracting the guards and cutting through a security fence, they planted explosives and detonated them, damaging the reactor. The French offered to build a new reactor to replace the damaged one, but Saddam wanted one up and running as soon as possible. So the French repaired the broken one, telling the Iraqis that they'd have to replace it in a couple years. A heretofore unknown eco-terrorist cell, Groupe d'Écologistes Français, would claim responsibility for the attack, but nobody believed civilian terrorists could pull this off. French investigators suspected it was probably the Israelis, but in French media there was rampant speculation blaming groups as various as the CIA, the KGB, the PLO, the Libyans, the Syrians, and some even blamed rogue elements within the French secret services that opposed French involvement in the Iraqi nuclear program. Regardless of where the public debate went, the Israelis had managed to buy themselves 2 years before the reactor would go hot. The Israelis would also assassinate Arab scientists working for the Iraqis, with the ones in Europe being easier to target than those in Iraq, where security was stricter. In 1978, they targeted Boutros Ibn Halim, who ended up giving the Mossad the schematics for al-Tuwaitha, as well as a list of Iraqi scientists in France. This intel not only helped the IAF plan their eventual airstrike, but it also helped the Mossad track down one of Saddam's leading scientists, Dr. Yahya el-Mashad. An Egyptian he recruited in 1975, Mashad had made a habit of meeting with a particular prostitute every time he visited Paris, Marie-Claude Magal, who had a history of working with the Mossad, though most likely unbeknownst to her. In June of 1980, she distracted Dr. Mashad while in his hotel room, allowing for an Israeli assassin to sneak into the bathroom, who proceeded to kill Mashad after Magal left the room. The prostitute was found dead 11 days later, allegedly killed in a hit-and-run by a black Mercedes. The case remains unsolved to this day. Many suspect the Mossad had her killed to tie up loose ends, while others believe it was agents of Saddam. After Mashad's death, Boutros Ibn Halim and his wife would return to Iraq, realizing that he may have inadvertently helped the Israelis kill him, who would not be the Mossad's last target. In August of 1980, another scientist, Dr. Salman Alami, would die of Lou Gehrig's disease in a Swiss hospital after visiting CERN. The doctors couldn't explain how he died of the disease so quickly, and forensic tests were inconclusive. This was followed by an Iraqi engineer, Abdel Rahman Rasool, found dead at a conference in Paris in September, allegedly poisoned. French scientists in both France and Iraq began receiving anonymous letters warning them to quit the nuclear project. This plot had some success as some scientists and companies started dropping out of the project, but Saddam made up for it by pouring more money into recruitment and security. In August of 1980, the Mossad plants bombs at the offices of the Italian company Snea Technet. The explosions did minor damage to the building and had no casualties, with another heretofore unknown terrorist group, the Committee to Safeguard the Islamic Republic, taking credit. Despite these setbacks, the Iraqi program would continue making progress. Saddam negotiates deals for additional uranium of varying qualities from Brazil, China, and India in 1979. In early 1980, Saddam secured additional secret uranium contracts from Portugal and Niger, as well as sending feelers out to Morocco and Pakistan, and received their first 12 kilograms of highly enriched uranium from France in June of 1980. The Iraqis tried to illicitly procure 1.5 kilograms of plutonium and highly enriched uranium from Italian suppliers, which set off alarm bells at the CIA. We do not know if they were successful. Whether or not these materials actually have been obtained, this information further highlights Iraqi determination to vigorously pursue acquisition of the capability for a weapons option. We would not at this time want to change our estimates on timing for the Iraqi program. In the near term, however, Israeli awareness of Iraqi efforts to secretly acquire plutonium is likely to substantially heighten their concerns about the Iraqi nuclear threat. Not all of Saddam's scientists were aware of this intent to weaponize the nuclear program. One of these scientists was the head of the nuclear program itself, Hussein al-Shahrastani, and when he discovered this, he refused to continue working on it. He would be arrested and tortured shortly after this in 1979. Now, most of these accounts assert that Shahrastani was arrested because he refused to work on the bomb, but most of these accounts also mention that he did not threaten to expose the program to the rest of the world, and how Shahrastani offered to continue working in Iraqi sciences in other capacities. And after the initial incident, he was relocated to a poorly funded local college to teach, most likely as a punishment. But after Shahrastani was arrested, he was tried for being an Iranian spy. Now, Shahrastani was a Shia Muslim, and so most of these accounts assert that this was a pretense for punishing him for not wanting to work on the bomb. Most of the books and memoirs documenting this account came out a decade or more ago, but in his 2021 autobiography, Escaping to Freedom, he admits that he was indeed acting as a spy for the Islamic Republic. But he also claims that Saddam had not intended to create a nuclear weapon prior to 1981, despite all the evidence to the contrary. But that's a whole story that I'm hoping to unravel in a future video. Anyways, after the reactor sabotage became international news, more global attention started to be paid to Saddam's nuclear ambitions, with foreign media starting to cover it more closely. Israeli media had been fairly quiet about it at the request of the government, but in the summer of 1980, the government began dropping hints about the program and its potential dangers. If the Iraqis get the bomb, it will be as though all the countries in the region are hanging from a light sewing thread, high above. Any attempt to use the nuclear bomb will lead immediately to the tearing of that thread and the crashing of the states. Israel cannot allow itself to sit and wait until an Iraqi bomb falls on our heads. Now, up to this point, I may have portrayed America's response to the Israeli concerns as a bit flippant. The Ford and Carter administrations certainly weren't as concerned about Iraqi nuclear ambitions as Israel was, but it would be unfair to describe them as doing nothing. Knowing that France's domestic nuclear power industry at the time was dependent on highly enriched uranium from the US, the Ford administration threatened to cease all uranium sales from the US to France if the deal with Iraq wasn't cancelled. Chirac, believing that the contracts were too valuable to give up, approved the transfer of highly enriched uranium from France's military stockpile. Henry Kissinger then arranged a conference in London with the major Western powers to beef up restrictions on nuclear proliferation to third world countries, which France would sign. However, Chirac and d'Estaing wouldn't fully comply with the agreement. They publicly canceled their deal to provide Pakistan with enriched uranium, but due to the Iraqi agreement still being officially secret, they didn't cancel it. President Carter came into office with a desire to end armed conflict around the world, and he believed he could do this by ceasing or canceling weapons sales to third world countries. In reality, all this did was give the Soviets a free hand in Africa and Latin America, but that's a story for another time. This same attitude can be seen in his efforts to expedite the Middle East peace process by insisting on a grand meeting that solved all outstanding issues, which would eventually be given up for a more piecemeal approach as was seen with the Camp David Accords, which you can learn more about in this previous video. In May of 1977, Carter meets with President d'Estaing of France, and for the first time in any of Carter's writings, I saw him say somebody was being too anti-Israel. I was troubled by his extremely antagonistic attitude towards Israel. He seemed quite convinced that the Israelis were international outlaws and that all the Arab positions were proper. Despite this, Carter was inclined to not trust the Israelis, with frequent complaints about AIPAC in his diary, as well as his entertaining conspiracy theories about the Israelis starting their nuclear program with stolen uranium. Because of this, it would be up to the State Department to lead the effort against the Iraqi nuclear program in the US. After the reactor sabotage in April 1979, the State Department began talking to the Italians about their involvement in Iraq's nuclear program. It is the American belief that the radiochemistry laboratory are susceptible to increase Iraq's possibilities of acquiring a military nuclear capability, and that there are well-founded fears that this is Iraq's political will. The State Department continued talking with France about their various nuclear ventures with third world countries, where they discovered the Italians were considering offering Saddam a heavy water reactor in hopes he would buy more conventional Italian arms and ships. Although by 1980 the Israelis had determined that they would have to do something about al-Tuwaitha themselves, they didn't stop diplomatic efforts, with Ambassador Ephraim Evron continuing to ask the State Department to stop French deliveries of uranium to Iraq. This total order was enough to build 3 bombs, which combined with the general attitudes about Saddam, filled Prime Minister Begin with an existential dread. The bloodiest and most irresponsible of all Arab regimes, with the exception of Gaddafi in Libya, has sent substantial forces to fight against Israel in all of the Arab-Israeli wars, and has never agreed to sign an armistice agreement after any of these wars, unlike the other Arab states. Despite this, U.S. Ambassador Samuel Lewis dismisses the concerns, insisting the IAEA inspections regime was sufficient to prevent it.
The Israelis assume from their own experience that the French can and will turn a blind eye to diversion of the material, and that in any case, inspectors are not that difficult to fool. The Israeli experience in spiriting weapons out of France in earlier times under the nose of the French government is one of the factors in their lack of confidence in any French assurances that the nuclear material, once in Baghdad, will be kept under effective observation.
But it was at this July 1980 meeting that put the CIA and State Department on high alert for any signs that the Israelis might be looking to unilaterally act against al-Tuwaitha. And around this time, both Amman and Mossad discovered that the smaller of the 2 French reactors, ISIS, was already hot, with the French scientists telling Israeli intelligence that the Osiris reactor would go hot in July 1981. And in October of 1980, the State Department learned that the IAEA wasn't confident in their ability to monitor Iraq's reactors, and had no special plans for monitoring al-Tuwaitha. They are thus likely to favor a covert and relatively measured nuclear weapons research and development effort, which, if ultimately called upon to do so, could reasonably be expected to produce several deliverable warheads before it was uncovered. This would rule out conspicuous shortcuts entailing diversion of French highly enriched uranium. We believe that it is unlikely that Iraq will attempt to build nuclear weapons before the late 1980s. War breaks out between Iraq and Iran on September 22, 1980. And on the 8th day of the conflict, 2 Iranian F-4 Phantoms drop bombs on al-Tuwaitha. The attack misses the reactors entirely, but manages to damage the water cooling system as well as scare off foreign scientists and technicians. The Iraqi military would take complete control of the facility and refuse to comply with what little IAEA oversight there was. After the attack, Saddam would deploy more surface-to-air missiles and radar systems to protect the facility from future attacks. The Israelis take an understandable interest in the outcomes of this attack, with Begin asking the CIA to provide any intelligence they had on the damage done to al-Tuwaitha. By October, Mossad director Yitzhak Hafez had told Begin that he didn't have the ability to stop the Iraqi program by sabotage alone. Like the Iranians, the Israelis realized a military option may be their only option. Begin's defense cabinet debated the best approach to deal with the reactors. Those that opposed the attack brought up that it wouldn't destroy the known supply of French uranium, nor would it destroy any procured clandestinely, and at best it would delay the production of a bomb. Those that supported the attack argued that letting the reactor go hot takes the military option off the table in the future, thus forcing them to indefinitely deal with a radical like Saddam. Additionally, an attack might scare off the foreign scientists running the facilities, thus providing a significant delay in getting a functional nuclear weapon program going. The pro-attack side would win the debate, but the next was how to attack the facility. The IDF Chief of Staff, Raphael Eitan, would present 3 options. The first was a special forces operation, deploying them via helicopters to raid the reactor facility and blow it up. The second plan involved a force over land to attack the reactor, and the third option was a bombing raid. Option 1 was rejected out of fear that Iraqi radar would detect the Israeli helicopters before they got there, and Option 2 was rejected because it would require troops crossing by land through one or more hostile Arab countries, only to come across al-Tuwaitha, which was guarded by electric fences and pillboxes. This left option 3, an air raid, as the most likely option to succeed with minimal casualties. And based on the intelligence assessments, the big Osiris reactor would go hot in September of 1981 at the latest, giving them less than a year to prepare. While the Israelis began their planning, the 1980 US elections brought Republican candidate Ronald Reagan to the White House, and he would be the most openly pro-Israel president up to that point. He believed that it was a moral obligation of the United States to protect the Jewish people. The Holocaust left America with a moral responsibility to ensure that what happened to the Jews under Hitler never happens again. We must not let it happen again. The civilized world owes a debt to the people who were the greatest victims of Hitler's madness. Now, the Israelis would have gone through with this operation regardless of who was in the White House, but they certainly felt more confident in taking this risk with Reagan there than they would have if Carter was there. And the attack wouldn't have been possible without American weapons, in particular the F-15 and F-16. The F-15 is a fighter jet designed in 1969 and went into service in 1976. The F-16 was designed as a bomber companion for the F-15 and would go into service in 1978. Upon their introduction, they became popular with American allies, including Israel, who placed an order for several dozen. Needing to upgrade their air force after the Yom Kippur War led France to cease weapon sales to Israel. But standing in the line right ahead of them was the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Iranians expressed an interest in buying the F-16 in 1977, but the sale was initially delayed by Congress in protest of the Shah's human rights record, but they were eventually approved. But after the Shah was ousted in February 1979, his order of F-16s were canceled. As Iran grew increasingly hostile over the course of 1979 and 1980, the Carter administration would begin sending American AWACS and F-15s to Saudi Arabia out of fear of an Iranian attack on Western oil interests. The Shah's F-16s were already in production and by 1980 were ready for delivery, so the White House approved for these orders to be delivered to the Israelis instead, who had placed their orders shortly after Iran. Israeli pilots would receive training for the F-16s at Hill Air Force Base in Utah in 1980, forming the core of the new Israeli Air Force. Colonel Aviron Sella of the Israeli Air Force was put in charge of coordinating the efforts of the IAF, Mossad, and Amman, and the General Staff. They used the plans of al-Tuwaitha procured from Mossad in Paris alongside photos from American spy satellites, as well as intelligence from former Savak agents inside the Savama to put together their attack plan. They couldn't take a direct flight to al-Tuwaitha, which would require them to fly over Jordan or Syria, who had radar and surface-to-air missiles. The best option they had was flying along the northern border of Saudi Arabia, which was largely unpopulated. The only military threat were the American aircraft stationed there to protect Saudi oil fields from Iranian attack. But to increase their protection, the F-15s carried jammers that could confuse most radar systems, and for those that it couldn't fool, such as the American AWACS, the F-15s and 16s would fly in close formation while over Saudi territory, which gives off a similar signal to the AWACS as a Boeing passenger airliner, which were a regular feature over Saudi Arabia by this time. The pilots chosen for this mission would continue their training from one of the last remaining Israeli air bases in the Sinai Peninsula, with only 2 of the 12 pilots knowing their ultimate target. If you're still watching the video at this point, then you must really enjoy my content, but you might be on the fence about whether or not to support the content, especially on an ongoing monthly basis. Well, luckily for you, we have alternatives. You can give a one-time contribution to Casual Historian via PayPal, or you could buy me a book from my Amazon wishlist. Doing the latter option, not only are you covering the cost of some of my research material, but you'll also be nudging me in the direction of one topic or another depending on which book you get. Both of those options, as well as a secret third thing, can all be found down in the description below. Thanks for your considerations, and now let's get back to the history. As signs of impending unilateral action by the Israelis accumulated, there were attempts to prevent it, both abroad and from within. After the failed Iranian attack, President d'Estaing of France invited Israeli Foreign Minister Yitzhak Shamir to meet with him in Paris, to reassure the Israelis that France wouldn't allow Saddam to get a nuclear weapon. Please believe me, if we ever have reason to suspect Iraq of trying to produce nuclear weapons, we will see to it that this does not happen. No punishment meted out to Israel would be comparable to the peril awaiting us if we let world opinion overrule our sense of self-preservation. The incoming Reagan administration warned the Israelis about their plan to approve the sale of the AWACS to Saudi Arabia, with Defense Secretary Weinberger officially announcing it in early February. The Israelis were opposed to the decision, but initially decided to leverage the new president's pro-Israeli disposition to get the sale of more F-15s approved to offset the potential threat of the Saudis having AWACS. The administration was worried that the Israelis might take military action in the region, but their eyes were on Lebanon, where a standoff between the Israelis and Syrians had been growing. Iraqi nuclear ambitions were not on their radar. The most surprising roadblocks, however, were domestic. The operations against Baghdad had been kept secret by Begin's government, but over the course of his first term, cabinet members had resigned or were replaced. This resulted in several people with knowledge of the operation being out of the government. Former Defense Minister Ezer Weizmann opposed military action against Iraq, and after his resignation in May 1980, he tried talking Agricultural Minister Ariel Sharon out of supporting the attack. The head of Israel's Atomic Energy Commission, Uzi Elaim, also opposed the attack and would leak the plan to Shimon Peres, hoping he could apply pressure from outside the government. Peres would leak the information to other former government members such as former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, former IDF Chief of Staff Mordechai Gur, and former Foreign Minister Abba Eban, who also leaked it to a few journalists. Shimon Peres opposed the attack for both practical and cynical reasons. He had personal experience in running a covert nuclear weapons program, having been placed in charge of Project Dimona by David Ben-Gurion in the 1950s. So he knew a thing or two about their production, and he was convinced that al-Tuwaitha facility was not equipped to produce nuclear weapons anytime soon.
I knew that the reactor was not capable of producing a nuclear weapon. For that, an entire complex of ancillary facilities would be required that would be harder to build than the reactor itself. I thought it better that Saddam Hussein continue on the wrong course he had chosen than be driven onto an alternative path, both more practical and more accessible toward his nuclear goal.
The other practical considerations for Perez's opposition were diplomatic. Israel was already in a diplomatic tight spot. Most of Europe had turned against Israel since the Yom Kippur War due to the oil embargo. Additionally, Israel was dealing with increased frequency of terror attacks and assassinations from various Palestinian terror groups, both within Israel and the occupied territories as well as abroad, especially the continued rocket fire coming from the PLO out of southern Lebanon. There were also the Camp David Accords to consider, which had successfully ended hostilities with Egypt. Perez feared attacking Iraq, especially at a time when they were at war with Iran, who had made enemies of the West, would politically isolate Israel. Some reasons overlapped both the political and personal, such as Perez's personal relationship with foreign leaders. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Shimon Peres was active in international socialist politics, joining in and participating in numerous conferences and internationals. This allowed him to meet and befriend numerous leaders of Europe before, during, and after their tenures in office, including the French socialist politician François Mitterrand. The government of Giscard d'Estaing had been openly pro-Arab and functionally anti-Israel, but Mitterrand and the Socialist Party were less hostile than the French right. France was holding a presidential election in 1981, the first round of which was scheduled for April 26th, and the second round scheduled for May 10th, the original date for Operation Opera. Mitterrand was the favorite to win the election, and in their various meetings over the prior 2 years, Mitterrand promised Perez that if he became president, he would cancel the delivery of any additional uranium to Iraq. Perez feared that this attack, especially at the planned time, could swing the French election back to d'Estaing, who might decide to help Iraq even more out of spite. And even if the attack didn't sway France's election, Perez feared that it would turn Mitterrand against Israel. And so, Perez wrote a letter to Begin to try and dissuade him.
Mr. Prime Minister, at the end of December 1980, you called me into your office in Jerusalem and told me about a certain extremely serious matter. You did not solicit to my response, and I myself, despite my instinctive feeling, did not respond in the circumstances that then existed. I feel this morning that it is my supreme civic duty to advise you, after serious consideration and in weighing the national interest, to desist from this thing. I add my voice, and it is not mine alone, to the voices of those who tell you not to do it, and certainly not at the present time in the present circumstances. Respectfully, Shimon Peres.
But as mentioned before, Perez's opposition had cynical motivations as well. Israel had its own election scheduled for June 30th, 1981. In the spring of 1981, Labor was ahead of the Likud in the polls, and Perez worried that a successful attack against a hostile regime with limited means to retaliate would tilt the Israeli electorate to the right, leading to the re-election of the Likud government. proving their victory in 1977 wasn't just a fluke. The 1981 election was, in some ways, even more important than that of 1977. True, the revolution happened in 1977, but the question being decided in 1981 was whether Likud's victory was a flash in the pan or a real change in the country's direction. As too many people had learned about the attack, Begin decided to postpone it to sometime in June, but the exact timing was shaky. He needed to launch the attacks before July, in part because that was the earliest estimate for how soon the Osiris reactor would go active, but he also wanted it to happen after the French presidential election, but before Israel's Knesset elections. Whereas Perez wanted to avoid the attack to prevent a worsening of relations with France, Begin wanted to utilize Mitterrand's predisposition towards Israel to soften the international blowback for the attack, just as he was relying on President Reagan's. Begin did fear souring relations with Egypt and Sadat, whom had taken a serious risk by making peace with Israel, but Begin had faith in the relationship he had built with Sadat. I feel that whatever Sadat may proclaim publicly, he will do nothing to upset our relationship drastically. Yes, it is risky, but it can be done. In fact, Sadat would be very helpful to Begin in this regard. Begin had wanted to schedule an in-person meeting with Sadat before the attack, but Sadat's people had kept delaying meetings. Ariel Sharon manages to get a meeting arranged for June 4th at Sharm el-Sheikh, a resort town in the Sinai that had been built up by the Israelis during the occupation and was about to be handed over to the Egyptians. During the meeting, Egypt's foreign minister, Kamal Hassan Ali, told Sharon that Sadat had intentionally delayed their meeting to coincide as closely as possible to Israeli elections in hopes of supporting Begin and the Likud, whom he had gained immense respect for. The Israelis, for their part, had been trying to speed this meeting up. They wanted the meeting between Begin and Sadat to happen as far apart from the attack as possible in order to dissuade other Arab countries from believing Sadat had prior knowledge of the attack. The Egyptians had been playing their own slowdown game in an effort to help Begin win the elections, even as we had tried to speed it up to insulate Sadat. Of course, Begin wanted the attack to happen before the election, but did he want this date in particular because he thought it would help him win the election? His political opponents certainly thought so, especially Perez, who resented Begin for it until his death in 2016. But most of the sources close to Begin believed his motives were earnest. Begin believed, and rightly so, that Perez wouldn't have launched the attack against the reactor had he won the election, and that he would have waited so long that the military option was no longer viable. So he had to attack before the election to ensure it happened at all. The attack would be scheduled for June 7th, the Sunday after the meeting with Sadat, in order to minimize the number of foreign technicians on site at al-Tuwaitha. The attack would be launched from Etzion Air Base in the Sinai, which was placed under lockdown the morning of June 7th, with the phone lines in and out of the base blocked. The Israelis avoided Soviet and American satellites detecting their preparations by performing them in all underground hangars. The F-16s were loaded with 900-kilogram Mark 84s, colloquially known as iron bombs. After revealing the intended target and going over the flight plan, the pilots took off at 3 p.m. The Israeli cabinet monitored the situation from Begin's apartment, and at 5:30 p.m., the premier received a call from the IDF chief, Rafael Eitan. Everything is in order. They are on their way home. Everything, that is, except the target. That's been destroyed. The operation had gone as smoothly as they could have hoped. They took off from Etzion, flying along the northern border of Saudi Arabia, and then turning north toward al-Tuwaitha. The first bombs broke through the concrete dome protecting the reactor, and the remaining were all dropped in through the resulting hole, obliterating the reactor as well as the cooling pool, and returned home unscathed. Unfortunately, most of the highly enriched uranium was stored deep underground, leaving Saddam with fuel to restart his program when it was convenient. 11 of the casualties from the attack would die, 10 of them being Iraqi soldiers, and 1 a French technician, who would die from the fumes of the attack. Almost immediately after the attack, Begin would be criticized by domestic political opposition. The Labour Party calls the attack a political stunt, which broke from the tradition of Israeli political parties maintaining a public consensus on defense and security issues that had held up through Rabin's first premiership. Begin didn't appreciate the insinuation that he would put Israeli lives in danger just to win an election. Would I send Jewish boys to risk death or captivity, which is worse than death? Would I send our boys into such danger for elections? Incredibly, to the end of his days, Shimon told me and others that this action was a mistake that was driven purely by political consideration. In a particular way it was. Begin later said that he ordered the bombing because he was convinced that if Perez became prime minister, he would never give the order to destroy the reactor, even though Saddam was fast developing a capacity to perpetrate another genocide against millions of Jews. Whether or not Begin had intended any electoral gains from Operation Opera, he certainly received it. the Likud would win 3 additional seats, bringing them up to 48 from the previous election. Partnering with the National Religious Party, Agudat Yisrael, Tami, and the Tahiyya parties, Begin formed a coalition to continue his government until his resignation in 1983. But when it came to the aftermath of the attack, domestic reactions were the least of Begin's worries. Between the Iran-Iraq War and the Syrian missiles in Lebanon, nobody in the White House was anticipating an attack on al-Tuwaitha. In the early evening of June 7th, Menachem Begin meets with U.S. Ambassador Samuel Lewis to inform the Americans of the attack. Got word of Israeli bombing of Iraq nuclear reactor. I swear I believe Armageddon is near. The attack had taken place during a round of shuttle diplomacy by U.S. Special Envoy Philip Habib, trying to talk Syria and Israel down from fighting over southern Lebanon and the Golans. This led the Arab world to believe that the U.S. knew about the attack beforehand. The Saudis tell the U.S. ambassador in Riyadh that Israeli planes flew over Saudi territory and claims this attack would undo the efforts they had made in the talks with Syria and Lebanon. The attack can embarrass the Saudis, their weakness allowing the Zionists to use their airspace to attack another Arab country. The Egyptians are calm, but Vice President Hosni Mubarak believes this will cause problems in the region, claiming the Soviets will use it as an excuse to build up Syrian arms. The U.S. representative in Baghdad, William Eagleton, believes the Iraqis will blame the U.S. for the attack. The State Department sends a telegram to all of its embassies and consulates in the Middle East and South Asia, warning them to be prepared for potential violence against U.S. diplomatic outposts. The State Department instructs Ambassador Lewis to get a justification from Begin for the attack, and whether they used American equipment. Begin had promised not to take credit for the attack until an Arab country publicly acknowledged it, in hopes of providing Saddam an out and avoid potential retaliation. On the day after the attack, a Jordanian radio station broadcast parliamentary debates in Amman, which had MPs accusing Israel of working with the Iranians to attack Iraq, which Begin interpreted as the green light to publicly announce the raid. For a long time, we have been watching with growing concern the construction of the atomic reactor, Osirak, from sources whose reliability is beyond any doubt. We learned that this reactor, despite its camouflage, is designed to produce atomic bombs. The target for such bombs would be Israel. This was clearly announced by the ruler of Iraq. The atomic bombs, which that reactor was capable of producing, whether from enriched uranium or from plutonium, would be of the Hiroshima size, thus a mortal danger to the people of Israel. The Israeli justification for the attack emphasized not only protecting Israelis from Saddam, but the necessity to act before the attack would become a risk to the Iraqis themselves. Within a short period of time, the Iraqi reactor would have been operational and hot. Under such circumstances, no government of Israel could contemplate bombing the reactor. Such an attack would have brought about a massive radioactive fallout over the city of Baghdad, and tens of thousands of innocent residents would have been hurt. We would thus have been compelled to passively observe the process of the production of atomic bombs in Iraq, whose ruling tyrant would not hesitate to launch them against Israeli cities, the centers of its population. Therefore, the government of Israel decided to act without further delay to ensure our people's existence. The Israelis also indirectly called out Italy and France for their contributions to the Iraqi nuclear program and spelt out what would become known as the Begin Doctrine. 2 European governments, in return for oil, have assisted the Iraqi tyrant in the construction of atomic weapons. We again call upon them to desist from this horrifying, inhuman deed. Under no circumstances will we allow an enemy to develop weapons of mass destruction against our people. We shall defend the citizens of Israel in time and with all means at our disposal. Begin's public statement did not assuage Arab anger at the U.S., all of whom presumed the U.S. was either behind the attack or had known about it but chose not to stop it. The U.S. embassies in Jordan and Saudi Arabia started demanding a stronger reaction by the U.S. toward the Israelis. Crown Prince Fahd of Saudi Arabia demands that the U.S. defend Saudi airspace in the event of another Israeli violation. As Eagleton had predicted, Iraqi Foreign Minister Saddam Hamadi accuses the U.S. of having known about the attack and calls an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council to condemn the Israelis. Now, the line from the Reagan administration to the Arab governments was that the United States had no prior knowledge of the attack, but that wasn't entirely true. Ambassador Lewis informed Secretary of State Alexander Haig about the talks between Israel and the Carter administrations, and his assessment from 1980 that the Israelis would probably act on their own if the US and other Western powers didn't take sufficient actions against the Iraqi nuclear program. Now, you could argue that the Reagan administration had no prior knowledge of the attack, but to make such an argument publicly would to admit to a lack of continuity or institutional memory within the institutions of the U.S. federal government. And so the State Department had to start slowly backing away from their assertion of ignorance. The administration began seeking additional information about the outcomes of the attack, soon confirming the death tolls, as well as the lack of fallout from the reactor over any nearby populations. U.S. defense attachés in Israel are briefed about the operation by the IDF. President Reagan meets with Arab and Israeli ambassadors, where he expresses that his priority is establishing peace in the region. The truth is that the Arab indignation on behalf of Iraq is a waste. Saddam Hussein is a no-good nut, and I think he was trying to build a nuclear weapon. He has called for the destruction of Israel, and he wants to be the leader of the Arab world. That's why he invaded Iran. Although Reagan was upset by the Israelis conducting the attack without prior warning, he was ultimately sympathetic to their reasoning. But the Israeli raid didn't just raise geopolitical questions for the administration, but legal ones as well. Most U.S. weapon sales to foreign militaries come with legal use stipulations, usually including a clause that the equipment would only be used for defensive purposes. After the attack, the legal question around the use of American-made F-15s and 16s rose immediately. Did the air raid on al-Tuwaitha count as a defensive act? Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger certainly thought it didn't, and advocated cutting off all military aid to Israel. Until the legal question could be resolved in Congress, the White House decided not to make an official judgment one way or the other, and instead chose to suspend the sale and delivery of additional F-16s to Israel. Reagan was inclined to give the Israelis the benefit of the doubt, since they had repeatedly brought up their concerns about Iraq to the previous administration, who never gave it the level of concern or priority he felt they deserved. Frankly, if Congress should decide that, I'll grant a presidential waiver. Iraq is technically still at war with Israel, and I believe that they were planning to build an atom bomb. The situation calmed down as the days turned to weeks, and there was no kinetic retaliation by Iraq, and by late June, it was believed that there wouldn't be, at least not in the region. But the CIA would warn about Saddam potentially retaliating through Palestinian proxies. And this would probably be the most prophetic assessment of the decade, because a year later, an attempted assassination of an Israeli ambassador to London, Shlomo Argov, by the Iraqi-backed Abu Nidal terrorist group would be used as justification for the IDF's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And although the CIA believed that the attack would not escalate into greater violence, they did believe that it would make Arab states less likely to engage in the peace process with Israel, even if they didn't border it. Arab leaders far from the front lines in the Levant have been shown that their military and economic facilities are not beyond the reach of Israel's striking power. Rather than drawing them into a negotiating process, Israel's demonstrated prowess will only speed the arms race. Tel Aviv has made the point that it will not allow an Arab state to develop nuclear weapons capability. In the absence of a U.S. restraint on Israel, Arab leaders will intensify their search for alternative ways to boost their security and protect their interests. In order to appease America's Arab allies, Reagan would allow a condemnation of the Israeli attack on al-Tuwaitha to be passed in the UN Security Council. But Iraq attempted to go even further by getting the IAEA Board of Governors to revoke Israel's credentials to attend the 1982 conference, though this was done not in response to Operation Opera, but rather to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. However, the Reagan administration would withdraw its support from the IAEA in protest until the credentials were restored, which they were. So the attack did not trigger a general war in the region, but was it successful in preventing Saddam from getting a nuclear weapon? Well, on a surface level, you could say yes. Despite trying for years, Saddam was never able to develop a working nuclear weapon. And today, nobody even cares who's in charge of Iraq anymore. But the question is a little more complicated than that. The attack was inarguably a setback for the Iraqi program, with it scaring off most of the French and Italian technicians, thus depriving the Iraqis of invaluable expertise and experience. A later CIA report assessed that the Iraqis would not be able to produce enough plutonium for a bomb before the 1990s. However, the attack incensed Saddam into pouring more resources into the program, which became even more clandestine, funding any alleged shortcut that could produce a weapon and delivery system, still utilizing Western companies in Italy and Germany. Israeli political leaders are divided on the efficacy of the attacks as well. Shimon Peres, who blames the attack for his loss in the 1981 elections, is dead certain it was at best ineffective.
The evidence now available shows that he might well have reached his destination, despite the bombing, had he not preempted himself by invading Kuwait in 1990, thereby bringing on his eventual defeat at the hands of the UN coalition.
Begin's foreign minister and successor as prime minister, Yitzhak Shamir, had a far more positive assessment of the operation's success. There can be little question that had it not been for Begin's decision to order the annihilation of that installation, the Gulf War that broke out 10 years later might well have had a grimmer outcome than it did. Despite this, the gratitude owed to Begin has never been adequately expressed, least of all by those eventually forced to wake up to the real nature of Saddam Hussein and his regime. Ariel Sharon's assessment focuses more on the illogic of those defending a balance of nuclear power in the region. Given the circumstances of our region, I always strenuously oppose the advocates of a Middle Eastern nuclear balance. Such a development would limit Israel's ability to defend itself even against minor terrorist raids. In any response we contemplated, we would always have to be aware and afraid of the fact that our enemies might make a catastrophic mistake in their evaluations. As a result, we would find ourselves the target of non-stop limited actions, and our hands would be tied. Sharon's successor as prime minister, Ehud Olmert, seems to have the most balanced perspective of Israeli leaders, which is notable due to his government being only the second to invoke the Begin Doctrine to take out a hostile country's nuclear program. It has been argued that destroying the Iraqi nuclear reactor was one of the most important military operations in Israel's history, and some even say that it was just as important as the peace treaty with Egypt. I think this is an overstatement. It was the right thing to do, but Iraq was far from developing a real nuclear capability. Considering the distance involved, Iraq would need missiles capable of delivering a warhead far beyond anything available to Saddam Hussein at the time. He had no way of retaliating at all. I think it's worth noting what the intelligence was saying at the time versus what we know now. Back in the 70s, both American and Israeli intelligence assessments believed that the Iraqis would be able to obtain a nuclear weapon at some point in the 1980s. The CIA believed it would be the late 80s, whereas the Mossad believed it would be the mid-80s. So based on the intelligence available at the time, they made the right call. The perception of the attack in the US has changed over time. The first Bush administration put a lot of effort into anti-proliferation efforts across the world, and during the Gulf War, Saddam's nuclear program was a major target of American forces, with the US discovering Saddam's sizable uranium stockpile after the war. Given how far along the Iraqi program was by the start of the war, Defense Secretary would publicly thank the Israelis afterwards.
Let me tonight, in front of this group, thank my good friend, David Ivory, for the action Israel took in 1981 with respect to the reactor. There were many times during the course of the buildup in the Gulf and the subsequent conflict that I gave thanks for the bold and dramatic action that had been taken some 10 years before.
A decade later, the second Bush administration would invoke Operation Opera in its defense of invading Iraq, emphasizing that the raid was initially condemned by the international community, but was later praised. Attitudes on preemptive warfare had changed, and although the 2003 invasion of Iraq would be condemned not long after it began, Operation Opera's reputation grew as the preferred form of intervention, so much so that basically nobody had any problem with Israel's strike against Syria's program in 2007. Of course, when it comes to invoking the Begin Doctrine, there is a bit of a pattern in who occupies the White House and how daring the Israelis are willing to be. In 1981, Ronald Reagan, an openly pro-Israeli president, was in the White House, which gave Begin the confidence to risk the attack. In 2007, George W. Bush, an evangelical Christian Zionist, knew about the planned attack on the Syrian reactor beforehand and had promised not to interfere with Ehud Olmert's operations. In 2010, Barack Obama, who was the most hostile president toward Israel since Jimmy Carter, was only willing to allow a cyber attack on Iran, using the Stuxnet virus, which was a joint project by both the US and Israel and had started development under George W. Bush. And in 2025, under an openly anti-Iranian Republican president, Donald Trump, Netanyahu had the confidence to launch the biggest and farthest-reaching military operation in Israel's history, against Iran's nuclear program, the outcome of which is still too early to tell. If you have any questions about this video or suggestions for future videos, feel free to leave those down in the comments below. And if you're interested in digging deeper into the topics of this video, you can find all of my sources listed down in the description below, along with the footnotes. I would also like to thank my newest channel members and patrons for supporting Casual Historian, Paul Herrick, Mickey Sargent, and Kimberly Naranjo. Their support allows me to keep making videos when sponsors in the algorithm are uncomfortable with the topics I choose to cover. I'd also like to thank a viewer for getting me these two books from my Amazon wishlist. I'd thank you by name, but unfortunately I have misplaced the little sheet of paper that comes with telling me who got it for me. Otherwise, I'd thank you by name, but thank you for these books. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.